Good evening, everyone, and welcome to the Institute for Government for this, I think you would agree, quite timely event, marking the first year of Donald Trump's second presidential term. My name's Hannah White, and I'm the CEO of the Institute for Government. Well, where to start? In the last 24 hours, the US president has released private WhatsApps from world leaders trying to talk him down on US policy towards Greenland, published an AI picture of himself in a US Greenland, and accused the UK of great stupidity over a separate deal that the US had previously endorsed over the Chagos Islands. So, how is the UK's approach to the US going? Are the tactics and strategies of the past year working for European governments? Will they change course? Can they change course? What more can we expect in the coming years, months, weeks, hours, maybe? I'm really delighted that we're holding this event today with our friends from UK in a Changing Europe, and we have a fantastic panel to discuss all these questions and the questions that I hope that you will bring to the discussion. We've got an hour and a quarter, so plenty of time to really get into the detail and the expertise of our panel, which is Sir Simon Fraser, who is Chair of Flint Global, Chair of Chatham House, and former Permanent Undersecretary at the Foreign and Commonwealth Office. Fiona Hill, who's joined us on screen. Welcome, Fiona. Now Chancellor of Durham University, Senior Fellow at the Brookings Institution, and formerly Presidential Advisor on Foreign Affairs to Donald Trump between 2017 and 2019, together with many other senior roles in the US service. And Professor Anna Menon, who is Director of UK in a Changing Europe. Okay, so we're going to kick off with some questions from me to the panel. I've got a Slido set up, so if you're watching online, please do send in any questions you'd like me to put to the panel. And if you like questions that other people have sent in, then you can upvote them so I can see which the most popular questions are and make sure I put those. And we will make sure to come to those of you who are in the room for questions, and if you're sitting next door, you may come to the door and stick your head around the corner in a very high-tech fashion, and I will know that you want to take to put a question. So I'm going to kick off with a question to Fiona. I think Fiona can hear us, and so this will be the test of whether we can hear her. Can you just set the scene for us, Fiona, by outlining what you see as the key differences between this Trump presidency and the last one?
I think I can give you a very classic, concrete example, because I've just run to you from what has been over just the last couple of days, endless series of meetings about Greenland. And in the first Trump administration, when I was in the role that you've just outlined there as the Senior Director for Europe and Russia at the National Security Council, and technically some kind of Deputy National Security Advisor to Trump, advice obviously was not often or was very rarely taken. I had actually been instructed by Ambassador Bolton as the National Security Advisor that Trump had got his eye on Greenland after a conversation with Ron Lauder. I mean, The Guardian has covered this quite extensively just in the last few days, and that we would have to try to turn this off, that Trump had got this idea that he was going to purchase Greenland, which obviously wasn't for sale then and isn't for sale now. And I'm using this as just a kind of an example in that first Trump administration, there were all kinds of constraints and people around him who really tried to restrain the worst of impulses. So this, the idea of Ambassador Bolton, he's talked about this, quite openly, and I think it's also, been in his book, the room where it all happened, was to, sort of bury this in process, create a memo that would go through all of the existing relationships between the United States and Greenland, going back to the 1951, security arrangement that allowed the United States to have bases, including what was then the Thule air base, all of which had been neglected by the United States. I mean, United States went from having, several thousand troops on Greenland during the Cold War to a couple of hundred, today. And the whole idea that, we might reinvigorate that security relationship, and all done in a very sensible fashion. But, each time, there was always that risk that Trump himself would kind of come out with something, outrageous about it, which he actually did, in the course of that administration, but it was quickly walked back again. What we've got now in, I think in glaring relief is the fact that there are no checks and balances on Trump or his impulses at all. And we now see, as if, we had any doubt before, that there's a highly personalized presidency, and it's one in which Trump feels absolutely empowered to do anything he wants at a time of his choosing, in the manner that he chooses, and to hell with all of the consequences. And that is basically the big fundamental difference. And I think Greenland sums it up perfectly.
And do you think for leaders around the world who are trying to work out how to respond to this, as you say, increasingly emboldened president who feels able to do and say whatever he wants whenever he wants to, do you think that the playbooks that they developed for working with him last time round are now useless? Are they adapting in an appropriate way to this sort of new Trump Unleashed? What can they do in this context?
I think they're going to have to adapt those playbooks. Again, this is, as you've just said, Hannah, Trump Unleashed. It's Trump. This is not the United States writ large. And what we're seeing in the way that he behaves abroad, he's behaving at home. It's interesting that he's choosing very northern regions to basically test out the limits of his power. And as you may recall, he's recently said, quite extraordinary sets of things, many things, in fact, one of which is that there are no limits to what he can do apart from his own constraints of his own morals, etc. And he is on the domestic front, literally at war with Minnesota and the city of Minneapolis specifically, at the same time that he's, trying to exert his will over Greenland. And I think, what people should take away from this is that, Trump himself is going to be extraordinarily difficult to manage, because the people around him who are supposed to have that job of managing him, be that Marco Rubio or J.D. Vance and others, are having a hard time of it. And instead, the people who are most successful are those who are egging him on, like Stephen Miller, for example. And so, the kind of methods of, sort of dealing and trying to deal and rationalize and look for, kind of analytical solutions and, kind of basically come up with compromises. Trump is not in a compromising mood. And I would argue that as of today, it should be crystal clear to everybody that Greenland is to Trump as Ukraine is to Putin. And if you're living here in the United States and jumping out of your skin every single second, kind of time is, kind of basically measured in the interval between Trump and his tweets. And that there is just a real kind of feeling that we're right in the middle of a crisis. It's not impending. It is already upon us. And I've just come back, from a whole series of meetings here with everyone from your whole phalanx of Danish senior officials, Iceland senior officials I just ran from. And we've got the Norwegians tomorrow. We've got the Swedes, kind of coming here right now. They've got it. And what they're looking for is unity from the UK and from other European counterparts, and trying to come up with a formula that, kind of basically tries to push back. And I think they've also come to the conclusion that there's no remonstrating with Trump himself. And so that what you have to do here is to try to get the United States, and not just people like myself here in think tanks, but those in Congress, in the markets, in US states, governors, mayors, you name it, but especially members of Congress, to actually stand up to their own responsibilities and to basically do something here. And I find myself in a very shameful position. I spent my whole professional career advising on how to manage Russia, and most recently for the last 25 years, how to manage Vladimir Putin. I think we're all now in the state of trying to figure out how to manage Donald Trump.
That's a pretty stark assessment. Thank you. I mean, just in terms of those sort of playbooks, the thing that became a bit of a sort of truism for people to be saying was, we should take Trump seriously, but not literally. But that now, to me, doesn't seem to be to hold.
You have to take it both. You have to take him literally. When he says he wants to own Greenland, he wants to own Greenland. And it's not about his legacy. It's about in the here and now. I mean, it's become very apparent to some of our Scandinavian colleagues that he absolutely 100% wants to own it. It's psychological for him, and he wants to own it right now. In the here and now, and certainly no later than July 4th, when, of course, we'll be celebrating the 250th anniversary of, basically US independence. And for any of you who think I'm exaggerating, I'm absolutely not. Just read the man himself. People should be subscribing to Truth Social. I mean, if you had any doubts, look at the exchanges, the text exchanges with Jonas Storer, and with others here. He makes himself crystal clear. The same for Putin. He makes himself crystal clear as well. And we can analyze and put all kinds of guys in this. We can talk about minerals. We can talk about security. This is simply coming down right now to Trump and his own id and his own ego. And everybody, who has, just some presence of mind is seeing this at this particular point. And it's just a kind of a question about whether the US can get its own act together, to basically restore some semblance of constraints around a presidency that has become so hyper-personalized that it is actually now, I think, operating to the real detriment of the United States, not just to the transatlantic alliance and everything else. Of course, it should be very uncomfortable, I know, for, diplomats. I've just come back from meeting with lots of, former diplomats who've been doged, or members of the intelligence community from the United States who've been expelled from their positions. And they're all, having to come to this, really difficult realization that we're in a massive crisis at this moment. And it's just exactly a year since, Trump's inauguration. It's now crystal clear for many people.
Simon, taking our perspective...
Follow that.
Bringing our perspective back to the UK, to the domestic. I mean, again, I think most people had decided that Keir Starmer's approach to Trump had been relatively successful. Certainly comparing his sort of work on the international scene compared to the domestic, it was seen to be something where he was doing a bit better. And, he had negotiated on the trade front something that looked a little, whether it was actually going to pan out, it looked a little better for us than for some other countries. Do you think we should be reassessing that view after the last week?
Well, I think, first of all, you need to think back to where he was and what he was trying to do. I think the first year was basically about, it was almost crisis management and damage limitation with this new president. We didn't know where he was going. Remember, it was a relatively new government and prime minister here. And of course, the stakes for any British prime minister are so high in the transatlantic relationship and the relationship with the president. So I don't think it's surprising that he adopted that policy of, hug him close and try and get alongside. And I think you're right to say, at least tactically, there were some benefits which appeared to flow from that in terms of using the royal visit to get alongside the trade deal, the influence that we were able to exercise in Ukraine, I think. Those are probably on the positive side. So fair enough. But the trouble with that was it was always really a tactic. And I think there was never really a clear sense of what the strategy was going to be. And they seemed to be just sort of, hug him close and hope for the midterms was about what it amounted to. And that was never really, in my mind, a sufficient policy. And what we have seen now is the unraveling to some extent. So we have a situation in which the President of the United States is suing the BBC. We have these threatened tariffs, obviously, over Greenland. We woke up this morning to this volte-face on the Chagos Islands. We have people around Trump supporting Tommy Robertson. We have this campaign about freedom of speech in our country, a whole range of things, but actually, it's pretty inimical. So you have to say, was the policy the right one? I think in the short term, possibly. But the idea that we can simply continue to say we have to calm it down and negotiate is inadequate. It may be the right immediate response to the situation we are in today, but then what after? And I've always thought that it was only credible if you do a couple of things. First of all, if you're going to negotiate, you've got to have some skin in the game. You've got to have some leverage. And you've got to have some sort of potential countermeasures that you are vaguely credible, and I'm not sure that we have found those. And secondly, you have to have a long-term understanding of what's changing and how you can move to de-risk your relationship with the United States, reduce your dependence on the United States, and develop alternative relationships in the fields of trade, politics, and security. And I think this country has been sort of slow to move on that in that direction. So we need to be realistic about what's happening in America, as described by Fiona, about the changes in American foreign policy priorities and what our position is in that changed set of priorities, which is lower than we probably think. And thirdly, about the realistic options that we have, particularly as a European country that is now outside the European Union, in finding relationships and partnerships that help us to build some sort of resilience in this new environment.
And one of the things that Keir Starmer did in order to equip himself to build a relationship with Trump was to find people around him, people who he brought into Number 10, people who've worked a lot on the sort of security side, who were able to either had relationships or were able to build relationships with Trump and his team. Do you think he has, in investing in those people, do you think he's been receiving balanced advice on the pros and cons of that hug him close approach? Is he also getting the counter view and being able to balance that? I
think the whole instinct of the British foreign policy machine will have been in favour of, hold him close, because that is British foreign policy towards the United States. And I think that some of the individuals, clearly that was Peter Mandelson's agenda when he went to Washington. Subsequent events apart, I thought that was a good appointment, but obviously it's unravelled. But it was very much Peter's position. And I think it's, I haven't talked in detail to Jonathan Powell and others, but clearly I would expect them to be in that position. So, that was a choice. They are very seasoned, experienced and capable people. I think there would be a lot of resistance in the system to people standing up and saying, look, we have got to sort of signal some sort of differentiation and distancing. That's a really difficult thing to do in the British foreign policy machine. So I'm not surprised that we haven't seen much of it. I think the government needs to find intelligent and cautious ways of airing that and surfacing that now in its public discourse. And Starmer has not so far done that, although in his speech yesterday, there were some small signals. For example, he said, this is the time to calm things down and to keep close. This is not the time for retaliatory or escalation. And then he said, we are not yet at that point. So he didn't absolutely exclude it, but let's see.
Alan, listening to what Fiona said and Simon's said, do you think the conclusion we have to draw is however good a relationship you think you can build with Donald Trump, it's actually never going to be enough to kind of insulate you from the possible vagaries of what he chooses to do?
That certainly seems to be the lesson of the last 24 hours. Up to relatively recently, I thought Starmer was doing pretty well. He was sort of balancing the relationships with the US and with the EU and indeed with China quite well. Unluckily for him, all those things seem to be coming for a head at the moment. And I think there were always three provisos to that sort of tightrope that Starmer was walking. Firstly, you needed to be careful not to go along with things that were egregiously against the way we want international relations to be. I personally was and remain very disappointed by the response of Europeans to what happened in Venezuela. People seem to be hiding between, well, we didn't like him anyway, without wondering about the sort of international law and the international system that we value. Secondly, I think it was always the point, because, Trump is Trump, but I think the secular direction of US foreign policy is going to be towards less interest in Europe, wanting Europeans to do more. We should have been hedging. So at the same time as trying to hug Donald Trump close, we should have been hedging for the future, because there's dealing with America now, and there's dealing with our security in 20 years, and the Prime Minister has to think about both. And the third thing that I found quite striking is, if you go to conferences about security, I was at a conference over the weekend where if you'd gone to the group about security, you'd have come back and invested in a bunker, quite frankly. It's just terrifying. The way experts talk about the instability in the world now really is scary. And every now and again, governments will say things like, we're putting ourselves on a war footing. The disjuncture between that and how they're actually governing and how they're actually communicating to the British people is absolutely huge. And it does seem to me that that is something that needs to be addressed. We're long overdue the point where Keir Starmer stands up and says, look, we don't want you to panic, but we're going to have to do things differently because there's a very, very dangerous world out there. I personally thought the ideal moment to do it was after the first Trump and Zelensky meeting. That was the moment when the Prime Minister could have stood up and said, we campaigned in a time of peace, we're governing in a time that is not nearly so peaceful. But I think at some point they have to do that, because the implications of all this for our politics and our economy. So if you think about it, we are rearming now, and we're rearming partly because Donald Trump told us to, but partly because we need to, because we're worried about the Americans. We're aiming to get to 3.5% of defence by what, 2032? Just from memory, I mean, there's absolutely no plan around this, but from memory, I think it's the case that the last time we were at 3.5% of GDP on defence, health spending was about 4% of GDP. In 2032, it'll be 9%. The trade-offs that are going to be required to do the things we say we're going to do and which we really need to do, we haven't even started thinking about them yet, let alone preparing the public.
Wasn't he sort of slightly nudging towards that yesterday, Starmer, in his very, very, very slightly, gently? But
I mean, yes, but I'm talking as much about the voter in general as I am about people like us who might have, told everyone in the House to shut up while we watch the statements.
Fiona, can I ask for your reflections on the way in which Starmer has approached the relationship with Trump, and whether you think it's been right so far, and whether you think it should change, or whether you think it's been wrong from the start?
I think it was wrong from the start at all, actually. I mean, however, I think it was apparent a crisis was going to come at some point. And I think, Simon and Anne both have kind of, laid out, I think, a perfectly reasonable analysis of, kind of where things have been. I mean, I don't disagree, with those assessments at all. And it is, kind of a natural thing to want to hug your allies close. And the United States and the UK are allies. But, at some point, if something goes wrong in the way that it has now, you have to make some hard choices. And getting back to what Anand has just said, I mean, I think that the one thing that I would fault, the government for overall is not engaging in these conversations. Now, you may, recall that I was part, along with a lot of people actually, the recent Strategic Defence Review that was, in fact, requested by Prime Minister Starmer. That was finished, as it were, a year ago almost, and it wasn't clear at the particular point when we were wrapping things up exactly what the line of travel was going to be in with the US. But I think a lot of things, certainly to me and to many others, were kind of apparent that there was going to be a reckoning. It was already there, with the fact that there'd been far too much reliance on the United States for security reasons for far too long. And Anand has, just laid that out. And I know that Simon, in his previous roles, was also, pointing this out. And one of the main recommendations of the Strategic Defence Review, when the report was finally published in early June of last year, was to start a national conversation about defence and what defence means in such an uncertain environment. Doesn't necessarily mean running out and investing in a bunker, although, that's always an option if things get, really bad. But it was involving people, understanding, where we were in the world, how much it had changed, and how, as we said within that report, the homeland was now on the pitch, not necessarily for, Russian tanks to appear, over the Suffolk Downs, but certainly in terms of attacks on our critical national infrastructure, cyber attacks, attacks to satellite installations, undersea cables, the pipelines that we have coming across the North Sea from Norway, carrying all of our gas. And then there's just endless propaganda assault. And frankly, in terms of the trade-offs, that we've all mentioned here, we actually need to make Britain, that's kind of was the conclusion of the report, fit for purpose. We actually do need to fix the roads, fix the health service, because defence medicine relies on the health service, for example. I mean, the UK needs to be able to deal with a mass casualty catastrophe of any kind. I mean, look what's just happened in the horrors in Spain, for example, or the nightclub fire in Switzerland. I mean, the UK would have a really hard time actually dealing with something of that magnitude, as we saw through for example, through COVID. So, you have to start to kind of think about, are we well positioned, to deal with any eventuality, not just, the prospect of, the incursion of the current war in Europe, into our territory. And the conclusion from the Strategic Defence Review was we needed to have more insurance in the terms of more investments. Obviously, it wasn't just about, what we're kind of seeing and all the needs that to re-equip, the various armed forces, but how could we invest in all of those vital systems systems and also get ourselves in the right kind of mentality to figure out that we're dealing with a much more uncertain and dangerous world, but without panicking everybody. And, the worst thing is the longer you wait to have that conversation, the more likely you are to panic people because it happens against the backdrop of a crisis. And all I can say is people in Iceland and Greenland and Denmark and elsewhere are pretty panicked right now, but it's not because of Vladimir Putin. They panicked about the implications of, this pressure from Donald Trump and what this might mean for their futures. And so this is the hard choice that we have now. And it gets back to some things that Simon and Anand have just said, that, the UK is going to have some hard choices about and a hard set of discussions about how does it best position itself. And it cannot rely on the United States in the way that it did previously.
There's a question that's come through on the Slido from an anonymous questioner. Do give us your name if you're willing to, which just relates to that, Fiona, asking, does Starmer's refusal to countenance retaliatory tariffs and the like mean that Trump won't take the UK seriously, and do we need to adopt some of the language being used by Macron?
I think the EU and Simon can both speak to this. Actually, already have 90+ billion of retaliatory tariffs that actually could come into play in February. And they can get into more detail about this. And then the question really is, how will the UK respond to that? But I think, basically the United Kingdom has other leverage with the United States and actually, can work behind the scenes as it has been doing, given the strength of some of these relationships. I mean, there's obviously kind of questions about the World Cup coming up, the anniversary, of American independence, the role of the royal family in various visits to the United States. There's all kinds of different things. That Britain, as the United Kingdom always has in motion, that can also come into play here. And again, there could be a debate about whether it's best for the United Kingdom to do some of the things in the way that Simon and Anand has suggested, which is behind the scenes in-depth discussions using these relationships, and then how it kind of comes in behind what the EU itself and other countries might decide to do that are not in the EU.
So.
I think on this question of whether Starmer should use the vocabulary of Macron, I don't think he needs to, and I don't think probably that would work here. He was clear yesterday on the principle. And he's stuck to this mantra, it's completely wrong. I think it's time to move that on a bit, but he did say that, and fine. And I think if you're going to, so I want to slightly make sure that I nuance what I said. I am not advocating that we should now sort of dramatically change our position and, wholesale or differentiate ourselves, move away from America. We have to be realistic about our options. That relationship matters in so many ways to us that we have to hold to it and preserve as much as we can of it for as long as we can, even if we think it is changing irrevocably over time. That is the obvious and logical thing to do. What I want to be equally convinced of, however, is that this government, the British Whitehall and Westminster, are doing the contingency planning, are prepared to admit, at least privately, that this change is happening, that the contingency planning for alternative approaches is in place, that they are sort of committed to building the relationships in Europe and elsewhere that will help us to defray the risk that we have in the relation with the United States. And I'm reasonably confident that is happening to a degree behind the scenes. And then the question is how you most effectively deploy that publicly in the interest of gaining leverage in the relationship with the United States, but not jettisoning leverage in the relationship with the United States. This is a delicate balance.
And talk us through the EU position and whether you think that's shifting.
Well, there isn't an EU position, but can I just come back quickly to what Simon was saying? So I think he's probably right in a world where there aren't lots of moving parts, but there are lots of moving parts. And I think if you're of the view, as I am, that in 20 years' time, we will be closer to Europe than we are now, particularly on security, and probably not as close to the United States as we are now, because the United States will be looking towards Asia. And we have to start planning towards that future now. I think it's worth bearing in mind that people in Europe are watching us. And if we're seen to be trying to play this little game where it's, well, actually we can square this circle and sort something out for ourselves while they're launching their trade bazookas and facing the consequences from Trump, that will impact on their willingness to work with us. And it makes it very, very complicated.
And I agree with
indeed.
that.
But I think, that is a potential problem. There isn't a European position. And one of the things Trump has done, whether it's cleverly or completely by accident, is he's threatened sanctions on some member states, not all member states. So what you're immediately getting is the member states that aren't threatened with sanctions saying, well, hang on a sec, let's not overreact. And it is a perfect way to divide those member states. As it is, the French and Germans barely seem able to talk to each other, let alone agree with each other. At the moment, and you have a whole variety of different opinions within the European Union that will make it very, very hard, I think, even to do the sanctions package, let alone to think about the anti-coercion mechanism, which Macron has been talking about. So it'll be very hard, I think, for the European Union to act in a unified way on this one.
So if you look forward now, given what the actions that Trump has taken this week, how would you see this playing out in the EU in terms of their response?
I think the most they will do is trigger those sanctions that were put in place at the time of Turnberry last year. But I think it will leave a lot of bad blood in discussions among member states. And if it leads to US sanctions being extended to other member states as well, it could get quite ugly within the Council, I think.
And you've touched on this, but in terms of the UK's planned renegotiation with the EU, thinking about what the aims and objectives of that have been for this government since they came in, do you think that what's happening in terms of the relationship with the US is shifting the way that the UK government is thinking about that?
I think yes, it probably is. I mean, the interesting thing is whether it's shifting the perspective on the European side as well. I mean, one of the interesting things, I think I said that the last time I spoke, this is the last time I spoke here. Back in May, there was a sense of shared endeavour in the face of the uncertainties generated by Trump. If that is generated again now, then I think the door is open to a far more sensible and grown-up conversation over things like SAFE than we had first time round. We'll just have to wait and see. But as I said, if it seems to the Europeans, if they take a fairly strong stance against Trump that we're playing some kind of double game, that will impact on their willingness to talk to us.
Can I say, I agree with that point, absolutely. I think we mustn't come out of this having distanced ourselves further from the European Union than we had. But I mean, the other point about this is, if there's a real crisis over Greenland, if there is then a real crisis about Ukraine, I mean, that could, the question is, to what extent can that really dramatically change the game on the UK-EU relationship?
And talk us through what you see as the risk to NATO.
The risk to NATO? Well, obviously, there's a risk to NATO over Greenland at the moment, in the sense that if Donald Trump does actually take aggressive military action, that is very serious. But even if he doesn't, there is already a loss of trust. Now, if you were Keir Starmer waking up this morning and hearing, after what you did yesterday, and hearing what Donald Trump said about the Chagos Islands, I mean, whatever residual trust you had must surely have gone. And that is a sort of one example of a bigger picture. So there is clearly an erosion of trust in NATO, and it could get worse. There's a very interesting question. Many people say, if the United States takes action, occupies Greenland, or bullies its way to acquire Greenland, that will be the end of NATO. I just wonder whether that is absolutely the case. I think it would be a fundamental change in NATO. But an interesting question, though, if you were the British government, would you want to walk away from some form of alliance with the United States still? Or would you try to redesign that alliance? It would certainly be less automatic in terms of mutual support. It would be more ad hoc. But would it lead to the complete destruction of the NATO alliance? I don't know the answer, but I think we should ask that question.
Fiona, I'm interested in your view on that.
Yeah, because I was just thinking, as Simon was laying that out, that this is actually kind of a dilemma that is playing out domestically here in the United States among members of the US Congress, which is, how do we feel if the United States acquires Greenland by buying it, even if it's under duress, through extortion, as opposed to through military action? And I think the assumption is, and people like Stephen Miller and others have said that there's no way that anyone would fight the United States for Greenland. And I think that might be an erroneous assumption. Because, when you're talking to the Danes and the Greenlanders, and I think I should just ask everybody here in the audience, go out and find someone from Greenland or Denmark and just have a chat to them about how they're feeling right now. I mean, I've met with the Greenland rep here, and the poor man doesn't look like he's slept in about 6 months. He points out that he's half Greenlandic and, half Danish, that, a good third of the Greenland population lives in Denmark itself. They don't want to be owned by anyone. And this is kind of a new form of enslaving in the way that the United States is talking about this. And people are thinking about leaving, the island and fleeing to Denmark or to other places. And some people are talking about fighting and resisting any kind of US takeover. So let's kind of take ourselves back to the Warsaw Pact. The Warsaw Pact is famously a military alliance that, fought its own members. Think about 1956 in Hungary and some kind of, images that might kind of play out in Nuuk or in any other, kind of Greenlandic settlement. 1956 in Hungary, 1968 Prague and the Prague Spring. I mean, basically, the Soviet Union invaded its own fellow members of the Warsaw Pact. And is NATO going to look like an organization that is, kind of basically standing by if there's any kind of violence in Greenland because of, the United States actually beefing up its presence in some way? Some of the people I've talked to, in the last day or so here, are all Americans, who've been in the Defense Department elsewhere, a little bit worried that, something might happen where the president decides he wants to redeploy troops, from Germany or, somewhere else to Greenland, for example, and that's misunderstood, as a kind of a deployment for occupation. Because actually, the United States does have the right under the 1951 treaty to increase, the number of troops here. But I just have to say that it might look one thing from the UK, but it looks, something very different from if you're sitting in Greenland or in Copenhagen, and frankly, from when you're sitting here in Washington, D.C., when you have, basically a president that's at war with cities of the United States and sending, military troops out. Whenever I get out of the metro, every morning now, I see the National Guard, standing at the on the platform or on, kind of basically the exit to my train stop in DuPont Circle, which is not exactly, the highest risk, place on the planet, I just have to say. So, I mean, we're in this kind of environment right now that it may look okay from one point, but when you're actually in the middle of it, it looks quite different. And then you don't know, with emotions being high, how people are going to respond and what kind of extra additions that will make to the crisis that we're already dealing with.
I think the reason why this will be near terminal for NATO, or one, as Fiona said, that in Scandinavia, the situation was simply unacceptable. But secondly, because Europeans are going to have to think about creating an alternative structure. Because if we're in the situation where the US is taking NATO territory, then we're in a situation where we don't trust the United States and our interests are no longer aligned. The problem with NATO is doing anything in NATO means the Americans get to hear about it because they dominate those structures. So at a certain point, and I'd be amazed if Europeans weren't talking about this at the moment, we need to figure out how Europeans can coordinate militarily independent of those structures. And I think if what Fiona's suggesting happens in Greenland, they're going to have to do that quite quickly.
Including Franco-British nuclear
quite possibly.
cooperation.
Okay, we're going to start coming to questions. I've got one that follows on from this discussion, which I'm going to take from Slido, and then I'm going to take a round of questions from the floor. Fiona, just building on what you were talking about, the situation within the US, we have another anonymous question that says, do we in the UK, I guess there's also a should we, have any plans for how much worse things may get domestically in the US and the implications that may have internationally? For example, can we assume that there definitely will be midterms that run in the way they should?
You should make any assumptions at the particular moment. And a part of it is because of what I've said, is that Trump himself is unconstrained. And, right now you're seeing a great reluctance on the part of all the institutions that everyone has relied on to actually constrain him in some way, which is not to say that people aren't speaking out, but people are hinging an awful lot on these midterms. Trump talks all the time about not having the midterms for a whole variety of different reasons. But if he's actually managed to invoke somehow the Insurrection Act, or, he's going to impose, as a result of that martial law in many different places, it might become remarkably difficult, to to hold midterm elections in key states. And of course, there's a delicious irony in all of this. This is the man who's saying that Volodymyr Zelensky is illegitimate because, under wartime scenario, Ukraine has failed to have a presidential election and other elections because of a state of emergency and martial law. So look, I think we're in an alternate universe here for most of us. I mean, I certainly feel it as a dual national and somebody who is, obviously deeply invested in things, kind of working out here in the United States. I mean, I live here, and I just can't stress enough that we have to be thinking of all kinds of different contingencies. I say this from a completely apolitical, independent, non-partisan perspective, that if I were analysing this as I analyse Russia or anywhere else, I would be, kind of sounding every alarm bell. And so, this is what I'm trying to do. And I think many other people are trying to do this as well. This is not a normal time, and we should not rationalise and analyse this into normalcy. And I think, unfortunately, for the UK in particular, because there is a special role that the UK has, as Simon has laid out, there's going to be some really hard choices about how you handle this. And the bar is and the stakes are very, very high about getting this right. And I think it is absolutely right not to blow it all up, because, we shouldn't give up on the United States. And, what we do now will really have implications moving forward. I think stressing the importance of those midterms and trying to ensure that they happen. Because, we don't know how they're going to turn out, actually, but just to have that regular electoral process is going to be very important.
It's worth adding that it's not just because of our special relationship with the United States that we're particularly exposed. It's because we're not in the European Union, which makes us more exposed.
Okay, we'll take some questions from the room. My colleague Maddie has a microphone. If you wouldn't mind telling us who you are, so we know where your question is coming from, that would be great. We'll take them in groups of 3. We'll start here. And panel, don't feel you need to answer all the questions. Answer the ones you feel best placed to answer.
No, my question may be particularly for Simon, but it will be more general. Sorry, I'm John Peet from The Economist, as some of you may know. I'd like to hear a bit more about what you think the E3, where the E3 might go from here. When we were a member of the European Union, we quite wanted to build up this notion of a Franco-German-British relationship in lots of areas, but including foreign and security policy. And I just wondered now where we are, we should continue to build that, irrespective of what happens on the reset and the future of our relationship with the EU, in the foreign and security policy area, and possibly even in the intelligence area. We should be putting much more emphasis on building the E3 as something that serves our interests. And it's not just because of Trump, it's because of actually a process that really began with Bush and Obama, that gradually the Americans were turning away from Europe, and therefore we needed to work more closely with our nearest neighbours.
Okay, more questions from here?
Philip Stevens, mainly for Fiona. Every conversation I've had over the past year with not just Brits, with Europeans about humouring, appeasing Trump, has ended up with, we can't afford to have the Americans cutting loose from Ukraine. As time's gone on, we're now buying the weapons, so you could say that Ukraine's dependency on the weapons is reduced, and the EU is providing finance. But I'm told by people at NATO that the dependency on ISTAR, intelligence, target acquisition, surveillance, is still really, really important to the Ukrainians. And if Trump, as he's done in the past, switches it off, it makes it much harder to defend. So I just like your view on, can the Ukrainians survive it, ISTAR being turned off permanently? And then the second question, I suppose...
I think we better do one question, because we've got lots of questions.
All right, very, very quickly. I was struck that Starmer mentioned the dependency on the nuclear deterrent, unprompted twice. Do you think that's a real threat?
Great. And then I think there was someone just behind. Maddie, just here. Thank you.
Hi, I'm Hussein Mohammed. I had a question for Simon more specifically, but when you were discussing about a redesign to the alliance when it comes to NATO and the US as well, what would the UK look for when it comes to that redesign in itself, especially with how much we rely on America when it comes to defence? Thank you.
Thank you. Simon?
On the E3 one, actually, I remember when I was in the Foreign Office, I was one of those who always advocated trilateralism, but it wasn't actually always welcomed. And there was another school of thought which thought we ought to build relationships around France and Germany and have a sort of British claque, which I always thought was never going to work and didn't work, but there we are. So the answer to your question is I obviously believe that we should be developing the relationships with France and Germany and other European countries such as Poland in the military, defence and other areas as best we can. But it's quite tricky. I mean, there are limits to what we can do because they are part of the European Union, and you saw with the SAFE programme that, you know, there's always a default to the EU if you're in the EU, quite rightly. So there are limits, but we can have bilateral development. We've got a defence relationship with France. We signed one last year with Germany. That is progress. The other side of that coin, however, is look at those countries. I mean, France is in a year of political turmoil leading to an uncertain outcome. So there are other considerations. So it's not easy, but we should do it. But beyond that, we should develop that. I mean, we need to be looking for coalitions of the willing in Europe with other Europeans, whether they're EU or other. And I think it's important and incumbent on the EU that they are not too rigid on enforcing the sort of EU as the only vehicle of cooperation that they want to work in. They've got to be more flexible. We've got to find ways back in. And that goes back to my point about crisis. If real crisis comes, which honestly it has not yet come, although I agree with Fiona, we're heading in that direction, then the dynamic could change. So we need to be open to all that. On the redesign of the alliance, I mean, I don't want to redesign NATO. I want NATO to work, and I want America to be committed to it, and its focus on defending Europe primarily against Russia to be continued. So it remains to be seen. But if America does some of the things that Fiona was describing, then clearly it cannot continue, and it certainly cannot continue in its current form with its current expectations. So it would depend on the nature of American action. I just think that it is sensible for us to think hard about, what really matters to us. This comes to the nuclear point as well. What really matters to us in the relationship with America, and how far and how fast we are able to effect change to that, and be realistic about it. I absolutely agree with the comment that was made, however, that we should be thinking about European security alternatives, because we've got to. The responsibility of government is to do contingency planning and think about outcomes. Now, we didn't do it with the Scottish referendum and got away with it. We didn't do it with the Brexit referendum. It seems to be a sort of fashion in government not to do the contingency planning. We need to do it. We absolutely need. We need to be brave enough to do it. We need to actually get on with it.
Thank you. Fiona, do you want to jump in on the Ukraine question, and then Anna, you can do whichever one you like?
She got a few points on all of them, because I think what Simon just said there is pretty important, and it was nice to hear John raising that whole idea of other European coalitions. And I don't disagree with what Simon said. I would just actually suggest that we also look at the Joint Expeditionary Force, which is where the UK does have a leading role. We looked at that in the Strategic Defence Review. It's become more to the forefront now because it is Northern European, and it's our Nordic and Baltic counterparts, including all of the Scandinavians. And I think that given where we are with this crisis, which as Simon is saying, it's not a wider crisis at this particular point, but it's very much a crisis over Greenland and over the whole future of the Greenland, Iceland, UK gap, the high north for sure. The JEF, the Joint Expeditionary Force, which of course has a headquarters in the United Kingdom and a whole kind of leadership that already exists, and certain levels of coordination could play a very important role there. And some of the countries in the JEF which are not in the EU, like Norway, for example, and also Iceland. I mean, admittedly, Iceland isn't a major military player, but Norway, is building up its defence and also its own kind of industrial base, using its considerable wealth that's derived from its North Sea oil and gas. So anyway, I just suggest that the Joint Expeditionary Force might also come into play here in different ways. I mean, I think pushing from that onto kind of Philip's point as well. That I think what we also have to remember is that the UK actually and other Europeans play an important role for the United States too. Because in terms of Ukraine and a lot of the intelligence that's collected comes from the UK, not just from the United States. We spend a whole lot of time talking about US systems, but the UK and Norway are also part of all those radar, early warning, and other networks. And there's some sort of considerable capacity. And when we were doing the Strategic Defence Review, for example, an awful lot of people at the Pentagon described the United Kingdom as a vital communications hub for the United States. In fact, one described it to us as basically equivalent to Hawaii, which may sound a little odd, but you can thinking about the placement of the United Kingdom, rather fortuitously geographically in that northern part of the hemisphere, and then of Hawaii in the Pacific. And it's also just this whole issue about Chegas, which frankly Trump is deploying for leverage, but it also underscores that the United States has a lot of interest in a lot of UK overseas possessions. So it's not just a one-way street here. I mean, I think Philip is right to flag this, and we've already seen Scott Bessent and others, asking questions about whether they might leverage aid to Ukraine here. But we're definitely in that realm now where we're going to have very hard conversations, kind of across the board, everybody, about how others contribute to the United States security as well, not just how the United States contributes to everyone else's security. And that might lead into that final question from Hussein about, some kind of redesign of the alliance. I mean, it really has to be where everybody else is playing a bigger role. Where the alliance, it really is an alliance. And I think that's what Simon was really, also getting at. And, kind of the other, point that John, Pete and others were making about, we've been in this discussion since Bush and Obama. I mean, Obama, the Wales summit of the NATO 2014, was like, what is Europe and what are European members of NATO going to be doing? And we now have Sweden and Finland who are in NATO. And the Finns, in particular, have lots of ideas. And so, kind of if we're thinking about redesign, it's really a kind of rebalancing. I think that's probably what, Simon was getting at there, where the European, contingent and Canada, we cannot rule out Canada here. We have to engage with Canada, start to be doing more on all of these, areas and issues here.
Anand?
I mean, Canada, of course, has the benefit of utter clarity on this, and it's well worth reading Mark Carney's speech today, which is fantastic and a sort of declaration of independence in a way from the United States. Philip, I heard Starmer say that, and I was shocked by it because it was quite an admission of dependence from the head of government. And whilst I've been scratching my head about it ever since he made that statement, I can find no reason to explain it in my head. I don't know why he said it, let alone saying it twice. It was a curious thing to say, and I wasn't sure who the intended audience was, to be perfectly honest. So I can't help you on that, but it was very, very striking. On the E3 will be fantastic for Britain. A good functioning E3 will be fantastic for Britain, but it's not up to us. And I think it's quite important, if we're trying to rejuvenate the E3, that the initiative doesn't come from us. It has to come from them. I mean, in order for that to happen, it would be nice if the French and Germans were actually talking to each other in a pleasant way, which they aren't. But I think, as ever, the problem with the E3 is going to be how you deal with the sensibilities of the others. If the E3 is talking about Ukraine, Poland will want to be there. If we're talking about Gaza, the Spanish and the Italians would want a seat at the table. And I think there we need to talk perhaps to the EU about having some involvement of the High Representative, just to ensure that line of communication. But I agree with you, the E3 wouldn't do everything, it's worth pointing out. We still need to think about that organisation for coordinating European military power. And I never thought I'd say this publicly, but I kind of miss the West European Union at the moment, because it would have been quite a handy institution to have around. And just a final point on what Simon was saying about crisis. Europeans do not, I don't think, really believe they're in crisis. Let me give you one comparison that is quite striking. Canada feels a crisis. It feels it very intensely. And what are they doing? They are tearing down barriers to trade between states that were built up for good political reasons between those states. They're saying that doesn't matter now. There is an external threat. We need to do it. If you look at the equivalent in Europe, which is Draghi, if we really felt the world was as dangerous as we should feel, Europeans will be tearing down those barriers themselves, completing the single market and more, as Draghi suggested, and responding to an external threat by increasing their own internal resilience. And still the petty political squabbles get in the way.
Okay, I want to get through another couple of sets of questions. Can you go to the back?
Hi, it's Alex Thomas from here at the Institute for Government. Would the UK and the EU be more secure under a President Trump or a President J.D. Vance?
And next, Alex, I think there's a... Yeah.
Gabby Hinsliff at The Guardian. Just coming back to what Anna was saying about the Carney's speech today, he made both a political argument that the old order is dead, but also a very specific list of ways in which Canada is making itself more resilient. It feels in the UK as if we've got to the first bit tacitly, but not got to the second bit, which is saying the old order is dead. Now what? We seem a bit stuck on the now what. If the panel were making an equivalent speech for Keir Starmer, in which he said openly, this is a very new and different world we're living in, and these are the 4 specific things I am doing to make the UK more resilient, what would you include? And would you advise Starmer to make it at this point, or to keep it in his back pocket and see if things get worse?
And here, just on the front row now.
Ben Alexander. I want to just pick up on Fiona's point that the institutions in the US aren't really stepping up at the moment. I think you particularly mentioned Congress. And if you do see them at some point stepping up, how would they do that? Do you think they'd be coaxing Trump back from the brink in the way that you described John Bolton doing it? Or do you think they would be trying to block him?
Great. Fiona, do you want to kick off on that set?
Yeah, I mean, these are great sets of questions. I don't know whether I really have an answer to Alex's questions about J.D. Vance, because I think, that J.D. Vance is a shapeshifter. I mean, it's incredibly difficult to know who's the real J.D. Vance. So if it's J.D. Vance who becomes like, kind of Nicolas Maduro to, kind of Chavez, no, it's not going to be any, particular change. But is he, someone who turns out to be a Gorbachev after Andropov, and who's kind of just, kind of cloaking himself in all of the kind of, the power of Trump and as the acolyte of Trump, only to turn out to do, kind of something different? I can't answer that question. I'm not even sure that J.D. Vance himself at the moment can answer that question. But I think it can be really sure that J.D. Vance and, Marco Rubio and a number of others are sticking really close to Trump and to whatever it is, the direction he's going, because he is the only person who can hand the mantle of power to them. And he has no intention of doing that right now anyway, because there's no way that Trump wants to be a lame duck. Trump is, thinking of himself in the here and now. So, I think it's... hard to say, and J.D. Vance would have to be, anointed, by Trump in any case. And the question would be, who is he beholden to? So if it's all the tech brothers, bros, the tech bros, the United Kingdom will be in a lot of peril, is all I can say from the things that we've seen, kind of thus far, emanating in that direction. Gabby's question about the Carney speech. The Canadians, obviously, 80% of Canadian trade is always with the United States. The vast majority of the Canadian population live along that border with the United States. Detroit and, kind of Ontario, kind of province are all kind of, literally joined at the hip and an umbilical cord, among them. This is very difficult for Canada. And I think, as Anand said, it's really quite extraordinary, what Carney has done here. And I think, it really underscores the sense, and UK should be paying attention. I remember it was Carney who also warned about, some of the risks of Brexit that, fell on, somewhat deaf ears in the United Kingdom. Carney's a pretty smart guy. And he's, done a pretty thorough assessment of the situation that Canada finds itself in. He knows that this is not a benign security environment, and this is, desperate measures. Plus, he also has all the Canadians behind him. I mean, we've already had, such a mass revulsion, apart from, in a few smaller quarters, to this idea of becoming the 51st state, that, there's an awful lot of Canadians who are already in support. You've got to build, that up, support for something similar over time. So, getting back to what Gabby has asked there, I suspect that if there is going to be a speech by Prime Minister Starmer, it's, kind of not even in his back pocket just yet. But, I think you have to have those dialogues. And again, getting back to what we said for the Strategic Defence Review, you need to have a dialogue. You need to talk to your population, not just to people sitting in London, but across the country, about how things have changed and how things, may change again in the future. And that the UK may have to also, shortly come up with some other plans about trading relations. And Canada, is an obvious place for the United Kingdom, plays all the close ties to start with. It's not just the European Union, and it's just European partners, Norway and others, and Switzerland and, other countries that are also, not fully within the EU. It is about Canada and other, trading partners. It's Japan, it's South Korea, it's India. I mean, the UK does have a lot of options, but you have to have a plan, kind of in place and a discussion about this to really get that underway. And I think Simon's already touched on that. The assumption and the hope is that those plans are, coming to fruition behind the scenes. It's just that, we can't necessarily see them, at the particular moment. And I do, basically, think, getting back to Ben Alexander's question, that really what we're more likely to see is to see members of Congress trying to block Trump. I mean, there are people around him who may try to coax, but, if you get, you get closer to the midterms, but I mean, I think the question is really, the crisis is here and now. You will see people trying to distance themselves from Trump, as they kind of worry about their own electoral fortunes. And once they know that they're going to be the candidate, in those midterm elections, they might feel a little more emboldened. But it's more like they're going to be, trying to move together because nobody wants to be exposed, to try to block him, from doing things.
Anand?
I mean, Alex Vance terrifies me, and he terrifies me because he's ideological. And I think the one thing we might see with the President Vance that we don't see with the President Trump is him deliberately working with the far right in our politics to try and advance their cause in other countries as well. I mean, Vance will be transnational in his politics. If it's this version of Vance, as Fiona says, that we get as president, that's what makes me really, really worried about him, is he will not shy away from systematic interference into our domestic politics, and that can be crippling. Gabby, I'm reassured that you think Starmer's done the first bit, because I don't. No. And we're still waiting. But I do think, I mean, you've hit the nail on the head. He needs to start talking about resilience a lot more, because I think that's the key concept at the moment. And if you were to make that speech, I suppose off the top of my head, there are 4 things you would do. Firstly, you'd reverse the silly tax pledges they made in opposition. Because as part of resilience, we're going to need the state spending more than it can now, and the state's going to have to tax us more because this is a time of national crisis. I mean, he should have done this ages ago. They shouldn't have made the pledges in the first place. They should have said from the start they were against Jeremy Hunt's second national insurance cut. But anyway, there is an opportunity now to use the international situation to try and make that argument. Secondly, they need to be a lot more explicit about their defence plans. They need to talk about this defence investment plan they're meant to be coming up with. They need to show us a roadmap to 3.5% of GDP. And they need to turn that not just into a target for spending, but a plan for spending it well on forces and equipment that is deployable now. It's all too easy with these targets that NATO sets for member states to spend it on silly stuff just to tick a box. They need to actually spend it on stuff that works. And the other thing I would say is, as Fiona said, is to leverage our global connections, working with the Commonwealth, working with other countries around the world. Our fears are shared by a huge number of countries, from Japan to Australia to New Zealand to indeed Canada, and working with those countries. As Carney hinted at quite strongly, he didn't hint at, he said it actually, in his speech. They're the 4 elements, I think, that should go into a speech initially.
I mean, I broadly agree with the elements. I just think the one thing I would add is, we could use that opportunity to actually start having a grown-up conversation about trade, which we haven't had since Brexit, and where our economic relationships really lie and where we need to focus them. But it's part of your global, but it applies in Europe as well. But I wanted to come on I agree on the 2 points. First of all, it's interesting on Carney. He has a different mandate from Starmer. He was elected on the basis of an American threat to Canadian sovereignty. So that's his mandate, and therefore he has license, I think, to do what he's doing. Starmer wasn't elected on that mandate, and I agree that I don't feel that he has declared the old order is dead. And I think this country is very reluctant to do that. And if anybody, we'll probably be the last to be in denial about it because we've got so much at stake about it. So he hasn't done that. And if he was going to make the speech, I wouldn't make it before the 1st of February because I think there is a negotiation period. Let's use it. But I hope that he is beginning to think about the elements of the speech because, as I said earlier, that's a responsibility of government. You've got to have a plan B.
Yeah.
I forgot one of my points for the speech, which was about the EU.
Yeah, I thought you might have forgot that.
And I think we need to have that conversation with the EU about resilience, about supply chains, about energy dependency, and all sorts of areas that go well beyond what we're talking to them about now. Resilience is a shared problem, and we need to portray it as such and start talking to the European Union about that.
Great. Okay, more questions here on the aisle.
That's bad forgetting that.
Thank you. Tim Dowse, formerly with the Foreign Office. Indeed, Simon's predecessor, his first job in the Foreign Office. I had a question about leverage. Looking at the last year, perhaps the one thing that we saw gave President Trump pause was the bond markets when they reacted very badly to his initial tariffs, and he went into reverse quite quickly. I understand that collectively, the European EU countries are the world's largest holders of US debt. And presumably China's the second, I would guess. But I just wonder is there potential leverage in that? I've noticed that the Danish Sovereign Wealth Fund has today said it's going to divest itself of US treasuries on the grounds that the US is no longer a good risk. But so the question is that a potential leverage, or is the weapon too double-edged?
Yeah.
Hi, my name's Asia Beckham. I'm American and former BBC World News journalist. My question is, what do you think Trump's intentions are with Putin and allowing Russia access to Greenland in the future? What would that look like? And my second question is, what do you think about what is Trump trying to achieve with Russia post-presidency, being that he just invited Putin to the Board of Peace? What is he trying to achieve in Greenland, and what is he trying to achieve in the Board of Peace?
Right. And I think there's a lady just behind you. Yeah.
Thank you. Glyn Evans, another ex-diplomat. My question is really for Fiona. As she pointed out, Trump does exactly what he states he's going to do. And after Greenland comes Canada. And I was wondering what the impact would be on the Congress and particularly the Republican Party if he seriously starts taking action against Canada for all the reasons she set out. And is it possible that somewhere within the Congress or the think tanks there are working parties setting up proposals on how to enhance US security in the Northern Arctic area without engaging in these kind of throwing your toys out of the pram antics? Thank you.
Fiona, those seem to be quite strongly in your wheelhouse. Do you want to kick off?
I mean, going backwards from, Glyn's point, I've just run from meeting after meeting after meeting with all kinds of, think tanks and others, just today before I joined you on this very topic. That this is, quite disastrous for the US's own security position. You alienate all of your neighbours. You say that this is, necessary Greenland for your security, and yet, you're actually destroying, the greatest source of your security, which is these tight relationships with all of the countries in that North Atlantic and Arctic zone. And I've never seen, Norwegians, Danes, Greenlanders, Icelanders, and others, more angry than I have in the last few days. So just to be very clear. And I mean, that really kind of fits into, what has been said about the bond markets. Yes, the Danes have made that decision. What if the Norwegian Sovereign Wealth Fund decided to do that? I mean, that is another big bazooka all of its own that doesn't come under the EU. And I mean, they are major investors in the United States. And, I've already talked to, over the last few weeks anyway, numbers of investors from Europe and elsewhere, whom maybe they may not be pulling out of current investments, but they're certainly thinking long and hard about whether they want to make any future commitments to the United States at this particular moment, and are wondering about, the future of their own, trade and other relationships with the United States under these circumstances. So the question really is, getting back and putting those two things together, how that gets fed back and to whom that gets fed back to. Trump seems to think that the United States is so big that this really doesn't matter. And I mean, that's his, personal sense of everything. And of course, he said it over and over again. But I would say that there's probably, a lot more cognizance of that interdependency and that kind of mutual, benefit that comes from all of these, financial and other and security ties, that you have, laid out here. That would have very negative impacts on the United States, both on its economy and on its security. So I mean, the kind of question is, how are those messages conveyed, and to whom are they conveyed? And then how does that, getting back to some of our first set of questions, really prove to be some kind of constraint on Trump himself personally? Because I mean, it's just really it's like Chernobyl. It's basically, there's no sarcophagus at this moment around the kind of highly volatile nuclear reactor, and Trump is just basically blowing up on all fronts. And he believes that he has all the leverage and that others, absolutely do not. And I mean, I think that's really the challenge, be it in the Arctic security, in alliances, in the financial bond and other, kind of markets, to make a different point. And when that comes back to David's kind of question about Putin, for Trump, Putin has been, really the gold standard of what a authoritarian leader, a strong man, should be. And, for Trump, it's kind of in a way he's been emulating Putin. And I think that, and looking very explicitly, I mean, I'm not, he says it himself, but I've witnessed it, kind of in, my previous role in Trump 1.0. I mean, he's sort of enthralled by the guy because it's what Trump thinks Putin can get away with, and how, Putin can exert unfettered power. And I think, where we've gone into really dangerous territory, that is in the wake of Venezuela and the success that he had there in decapitating, the Maduro regime, literally, that he now thinks that he can do anything at all. And he may even believe that he's more powerful than Putin because he can deploy at will, without any kind of constraint, all of the levers of American power, he alone. And Putin, of course, Russia simply doesn't have those levers. Russia, has made some huge strategic blunders, that have diminished its power and its global standing. And I think that's a real risk, here for the United States. The Board of Peace, I mean, is really kind of Trump's efforts to create his own personal version of the UN Security Council. I think it's been pretty well covered, in the press. And in classic Trump fashion, it's pay to play. And, God knows what will happen to those billions, and, which meme coins and cryptocurrencies and which of the various, Trump enterprises that money will be invested in. And I think, I cannot underscore enough, how much the United States has started to emulate Russia, in ways that I would never have thought conceivable, kind of a few years ago, even in the first Trump administration.
I mean, just quickly on the Treasury's point, I mean, the danger, of course, is an economic crisis in the US blows back onto European governments whose economies are very weak. And it would be very ironic, wouldn't it, if measures to stand up to Trump lead to us having Prime Minister Farage and President Bardella, because our economies start to struggle. And I think that will be very high in the minds of European statesmen. I don't know what Trump wants what Trump wants, but I think the thing that makes it really hard to deal with him is he's fundamentally dishonest. His arguments about Greenland are clearly dishonest. So actually sending troops to Greenland to try and counter the argument he's making at the moment struck me as something of a waste of time, because he just moves on to a different argument. But basically, when Trump sets his mind on something, he's dishonest in getting it, and it's very, very, I mean, that's one of the reasons why it's so hard to read and so hard to deal with him, is he's not the straight talker, as he sometimes like portray himself. He talks rubbish some of the times. He talks nonsense. And I just don't envy those diplomats that are facing that and having to try and react to it.
I think, Tim, the other, of course, it wasn't just the bond market. The other force that has stood up to Trump is China. And that is because China has this chokehold on critical minerals, and specifically refinement of critical minerals, combined with great power status and a unified political polity or regime. Europe hasn't found its choke point. You're identifying one. We also don't have a sort of unified great power status, and we have a sort of psychology of weakness relative to the United States. So the challenge is quite a significant one for us. But I agree, we should be looking for those points of leverage and how we can collectively apply them. On Putin, I mean, it seemed to me that Trump's attitude towards Putin was made quite clear in the national security strategy, which is basically we need to sort of neutralize Russia, the Russia issue, so we can focus on China. And if that's true, provided that he feels he's got security in the north, I don't think Trump cares about Putin. I think he will leave it, let the Europeans suffer that and deal with it. And I think if there were to be some sort of ceasefire which freezes conflict in Ukraine, Trump would move quite rapidly to reopen economic and other relations with Putin. I basically don't think he has any sort of values-driven agenda towards Putin or cares beyond, what Putin represents, the individual and the nature and the way he wields power, but also where he fits into the sort of great game between China and the United States.
Yeah. Okay, I'm afraid we're going to have to leave it there, not least because I think we might all get very depressed if we carry on. We're not depressed enough. It really is remarkable how much has happened over the last year, and I think it's highly likely we'll be back on this stage discussing this again in a year's time, and I don't take too many bets on where we will be by then. Can I just ask you to join me in thanking our excellent panel, Fiona Hill, Sir Simon Fraser, and Anand Menon.
Well done.
And big thanks to UK Changing Europe for partnering with us on this event. And thank you to everyone who's joined us. Just to say we have more exciting events coming up at the IFG if you want to join us. Including having Eluned Morgan, the First Minister of Wales, here on Thursday for an In Conversation event. And we will be having more events around the upcoming elections in May over the next few weeks and months. So look out for those. Thanks, everyone.